Welcome in, everyone. Today's deep dive, well, it's a bit of a heavy one. We're tackling grief and loss.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that touches everyone at some point.
We're going to be pulling mostly from Megan Devine's It's Okay That You're Not Okay.
Great book.
Yeah.
Really insightful.
We'll have some quotes sprinkled in and even some of the resources that Devine recommends in the book.
It's kind of like we're building a toolkit.
Exactly. For understanding and supporting grief. Because honestly, it feels like we're all kind of terrible at it, right? Both dealing with our own grief and being there for others who are hurting.
It really does feel like we're hardwired to get it wrong somehow.
That's what Devine says. She straight up argues that the way we deal with grief in Western culture, it's just broken.
Broken's a good word for it. The book starts with this powerful image. It's almost like people are sprinting away from anyone who's grieving, like it's contagious.
Oh my gosh, I know. And then the platitudes start flying.
The platitudes, oh yeah, they don't help at all.
Time heals all wounds, or my personal least favorite. They're in a better place now.
Like somehow those words are supposed to just erase the pain.
Right, it's crazy. Devine actually shares some of the awful things people said to her after her partner died.
Oh, I remember that part.
Like, get this. Someone actually told her that she wasn't spiritual enough to be handling it well.
It's wild, isn't it? But those comments, as insensitive as they reveal a deeper issue.
What do you mean?
It's like they're implying that the person grieving is somehow to blame for their pain, that they're overreacting, or that they just need to snap out of it.
It's almost like grief makes people so uncomfortable they want to shove it under the rug and pretend it's not happening.
Exactly. And all that does is make the person who is grieving feel even more alone and isolated.
Okay, so if that's the wrong way to deal with grief, what does a healthy approach look like?
Well, that's where Devine's book is so helpful. She argues that we need to stop treating grief like it's a problem to be solved.
I remember she uses this analogy of a wave, like grief is something you learn to ride, not something you conquer.
Yes, that's the perfect way to put it. And she makes this really important distinction between pain and suffering.
That was a huge light bulb moment for me in the book.
She says that pain, the heartache, it's natural and inevitable after a loss. Suffering, though, that comes from fighting against the pain, trying to pretend it's not there.
It's so true. It's like the more you resist it, the stronger it gets.
Exactly. So instead of focusing on getting to closure or moving through stages, Divine suggests we focus on learning to live with the pain, not erasing it.
That makes so much more sense. So how do we do that? How do we live with the pain?
She offers a lot of practical tools in the book for managing those really tough emotions, like learning how to identify your triggers.
Triggers.
Yeah, those things that just set off a wave of grief, and treating yourself with kindness.
Like being your own best friend.
Exactly. And creating a safe space for yourself, wherever that may be, where you can just let yourself feel whatever comes up.
So it's about recognizing that grief is not just an emotional experience, it's a full body experience, right?
Absolutely. The book talks a lot about the physical manifestations of grief, like how it impacts our sleep, our energy levels, even our ability to think straight.
It's crazy how interconnected our minds and bodies are. I remember reading about her waking up, reaching for her partner, or even feeling his aches and pains in her body.
Isn't that wild? It really shows how deep grief goes.
Yeah.
It's not just in our heads. And she offers practical advice for managing those physical challenges too.
Well, what?
Things like prioritizing sleep, getting some exercise if you can, understanding how stress impacts your body, even knowing when to seek medical help if you need it. It's like sometimes we forget that our bodies are actually part of us.
Right. Like we think we can just compartmentalize our emotions and pretend everything's fine. But grief, it doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't. And that's actually one of the things Divine talks about a lot in the book, this whole idea of an anti-grief narrative.
Anti-grief narrative, what does that even mean?
It's this pervasive idea that we're supposed to be happy all the time, that any kind of negative emotion is like a weakness or a failure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just look at social media. Everyone's always posting these picture-perfect versions of their lives. It's exhausting.
Right, and it's totally unrealistic.
Yeah.
But that whole cult of positivity, as Divine calls it, can be really damaging, especially when you're dealing with grief.
I can see how that would be. You're already feeling so much pain and sadness, and then on top of that, you're being told you shouldn't feel that way.
Exactly. And it makes people feel like they have to hide their true feelings, like they have to pretend everything's okay when it's really not.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It's not going to actually fix anything.
Exactly. So it's not about denying the possibility of positive emotions, but recognizing that pain and sadness are also valid parts of the human experience, especially when you've experienced a loss.
It's about embracing all of our emotions, the good, the bad, the ugly.
Precisely.
Now, one thing I found really interesting in the book was the way Devine talks about the physical sensations of grief.
Oh, yeah, that's something we often overlook, don't we?
It's like we think of grief as this purely emotional thing, but it's so much more than that. It affects us on a cellular level.
It really does. She even describes those early days of grief as feeling like a physical assault on her body.
Mhm.
Remember that story about waking up reaching for her partner or feeling his aches and
Oh my
pains?
gosh, yeah. It really highlights just how interconnected our minds and bodies truly are, especially in the face of something as intense as grief.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
And it makes sense when you think about it. Like, I know whenever I'm really stressed or anxious, I tend to get headaches or stomach aches. It's like my body's trying to tell me something's wrong.
Absolutely. And grief is like stress on steroids. It floods our systems with hormones that can have a huge impact on everything from our sleep and energy levels to our immune systems, even our cognitive function.
Now that you mention it, Divine does talk about experiencing memory lapses, difficulty concentrating, even a sense of time distortion after her partner died. It's like grief throws our whole brains out of whack.
Exactly. And for someone going through it, it can be really disorienting. You're trying to function in this fog of grief, and everything just feels a little bit off. And she uses that phrase, losing your mind.
Wow, that's powerful.
But she reassures readers that it's a normal part of the process. Your brain is working overtime trying to process this huge loss, and sometimes it just can't keep up.
So, is there anything we can do to manage those cognitive challenges? I mean, it sounds pretty scary.
There are things that can help. Divine suggests creating routines, like to give your brain a sense of structure, breaking tasks into smaller, more manageable steps. And of course, being patient with yourself. Remember, your brain is under a lot of stress, so give it some grace.
It's like giving yourself permission to slow down, to not be firing on all cylinders.
Exactly. And if the challenges become really overwhelming or persistent, don't hesitate to seek professional support from a therapist or counselor.
That's great advice. And speaking of support, another part of the book that really resonated with me was Divine's advice on navigating support systems. Because honestly, it can be such a minefield, both for the person who's grieving and for those trying to support them.
Oh, I totally agree. It can be so hard to know what to do or say. And sometimes even well-intentioned efforts can backfire and end up doing more harm than good.
I remember she talks about anticipating needs instead of waiting for the grieving person to ask for help.
Yes, because when you're grieving, it can be so hard to even know what you need, let alone articulate it to others.
It's like your brain is just in survival mode, just trying to get through each day.
Exactly. So instead of putting that burden on them, be proactive. Offer to bring over a meal, walk their dog, pick up their dry cleaning, or just sit with them in silence.
Those little things can make such a big difference. It's about taking some of the load off their shoulders.
Exactly. And it's about showing up, being present, and letting them know they're not alone in this.
And the other big piece of advice she gives, which I think is so crucial, is about respecting boundaries.
Oh, absolutely.
The person grieving gets to decide who they share their story with and how much they want to reveal.
No pushing for details, no trying to force them to open up before they're ready.
Right. It's about creating a safe space for them to express their grief at their own pace, in their own way.
Exactly. And sometimes the most supportive thing we can do is simply sit in silence with them, holding space for their grief without trying to change it or fix it.
Just being a witness to their pain.
Exactly. And remember, supporting someone through grief can be challenging for the support person too. It's okay to acknowledge that. You're allowed to feel your own emotions.
It's okay to admit that you don't have all the answers, that you don't know what to say.
Exactly. Sometimes the most honest and supportive thing you can say is, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you.
And speaking of people who get it, another important concept in the book is this idea of the tribe of after.
Ah, yes. The community of people who truly understand because they've been through the fire of grief themselves.
Divine talks about how connecting with other grievers can be so healing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It can reduce those feelings of isolation, create a safe space to be completely honest about your feelings, and remind you that you're not alone.
She even shares this really moving anecdote about accidentally talking about a friend's deceased son as if he were still alive.
Oh, that one got to me.
It really shows how deeply we can connect with those who share our grief, almost like their loved ones become part of our own internal landscape.
Exactly. And she even includes a list of resources in the appendix of the book, emphasizing that support is out there. if you know where to look.
So, after diving into all of this, what do you think is the key takeaway for our listeners? How can we be better at grief?
I think the most important thing to remember is that there's no right or wrong way to grieve.
It's not a competition, and there's no timeline for getting over it.
Right. It's a messy, unpredictable process, and everyone experiences it differently. So instead of focusing on fixing grief, let's shift our attention to honoring it.
Honoring it. I like that.
Be present with the pain, offer kindness and compassion to yourself and to others who are grieving, and create space for authentic expression.
And remember, you don't have to go through this alone. There are people who understand, people who can help. Reach out, find your tribe, and allow yourself to be supported.
Exactly. Now, another thing that Devine dives into is this idea of the cognitive effects of grief.
Cognitive effects. What do you mean by that?
Basically, the impact grief has on our brains. Remember those memory lapses, the difficulty concentrating, the feeling of time distortion?
Oh, yeah. I remember her saying it felt like she was losing her mind.
Right. And a lot of people who are grieving experience similar things. It can be scary
Yeah.
because it's like your brain just isn't working the way it used to.
So what causes that?
Well, your brain is trying to process this huge loss, and it can get overloaded, like a computer that's trying to run too many programs at once.
So are there things people can do to manage those cognitive challenges?
Absolutely. Devine suggests things like creating routines to give your brain some structure,
Oh, okay.
breaking tasks down into smaller, more manageable steps, and practicing patience with yourself. Your brain is under a lot of stress, so give it time to adjust.
It's like telling yourself, hey, it's okay to not be operating at 100% right now.
Exactly. And if the challenges become too overwhelming, don't hesitate to reach out to a therapist or counselor. There's no shame in asking for help. Now, another thing Devine explores in the book, which I found really interesting, is this idea of using creative expression as a tool for navigating grief.
Oh, that's cool. I hadn't really thought about that before.
It's not something we always talk about, but it can be incredibly powerful. Think about art, music, writing. They're all ways of expressing emotions that words sometimes can't capture.
I can see how that would be helpful. Sometimes it's hard to even put into words what you're feeling.
Exactly. And Devine talks about how using these creative outlets can help you process emotions, connect with your inner self, and even find meaning in the midst of loss.
So it's not about creating a masterpiece, it's about the process itself.
Exactly. And she shares her own experiences with writing as a way to connect with her deceased partner and to make sense of her grief. And she encourages readers to experiment, to find what resonates with them, and to be open to the surprises that can emerge through creative expression.
It's like giving your grief a voice, a way to be heard.
Exactly. And creative expression can also be a way to connect with other people who are grieving. Sharing your work with others can create a sense of shared understanding and validation. It's a reminder that you're not alone in this.
I like that. It's like using creativity to build bridges of connection and support. So it sounds like we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, from the societal pressures to get over grief, to the very real physical and emotional and cognitive challenges it presents.
And the importance of finding support, connecting with others who understand, and giving ourselves permission to grieve in our own way and at our own pace.
Exactly.
Now, I know Devine also delves into the cultural context of grief and how societal expectations can often make an already difficult experience even harder.
Oh, absolutely. She argues that Western culture, in particular, has this really narrow view of grief, like it's something to be feared and avoided.
It's like we're so uncomfortable with the messiness of grief that we try to sanitize it, package it neatly, and tuck it away as quickly as possible.
Exactly. And that can lead to a lot of harmful behaviors and attitudes, like the prevalence of toxic positivity, for example.
Oh my gosh, yes, the pressure to be happy all the time, it's exhausting.
And it's completely unrealistic.
Mm-hmm.
But it can make people feel like they have to hide their true feelings, like they have to pretend everything's okay when it's really not. And Devine points out how this aversion to grief can lead to a real lack of support for those who are struggling.
It's like people are just left to grieve in isolation, feeling like they're doing it wrong or that they're not moving on fast enough.
Exactly. And so she challenges us to create a more compassionate and supportive culture around loss.
So how do we do that? How do we shift from a culture that avoids grief to one that embraces it?
It starts with normalizing grief, acknowledging that it's a natural and healthy response to loss, and creating space for people to grieve in their own way, at their own pace.
It's about shifting from a culture of fixing grief to a culture of honoring grief.
I love that. And she offers a lot of practical suggestions for creating a more grief-literate culture. Things like educating ourselves about grief, challenging those societal expectations, and creating safe spaces for people to share their stories and to find support.
And listening to those who are grieving, validating their experiences, and offering practical help where we can.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where grief is not seen as a weakness or a taboo, but as a natural part of life, a part that deserves to be acknowledged, honored, and supported.
I love that. Now, one thing that really struck me in the book is how Devine talks about the complexities of navigating relationships in the midst of grief.
Oh, absolutely. Grief can change us, both internally and in our interactions with others.
And it can definitely strain relationships, even the strongest ones. It's like you're walking around with this raw, exposed nerve, and even the slightest touch can send you reeling.
Exactly. And she acknowledges that even the most well-intentioned friends and family members can sometimes say or do things that are hurtful, even if unintentionally.
I think that's one of the hardest things about grief. It can make you feel so isolated, even from the people you love the most.
It can. And Devine talks about how our own discomfort with grief can lead us to try to fix it or to minimize it, which can be really invalidating for the person who's grieving.
It's like that urge to offer solutions or advice when sometimes all the person needs is a listening ear and a shoulder to cry on.
Exactly. And we might say things like, you need to be strong, or time heals all wounds, without realizing how dismissive those statements can feel to someone who's in the thick of it.
It's like we're saying, your grief is a problem, and here's how to solve it.
Exactly. And so Devine emphasizes that the most supportive thing we can do is simply listen, validate their experiences, and offer unconditional love and presence.
It's about showing up without an agenda, without trying to fix or change anything, just being there with them in their pain.
You're getting it.
Mm-hmm.
And she also talks about the importance of setting boundaries, both for the person who's grieving and for those who are supporting them.
Boundaries are so important, especially when you're feeling so vulnerable and raw.
They are. And Devine reminds us that it's okay to say no to things, to take space when you need it, and to protect your energy. Grief can be incredibly draining, so it's crucial to prioritize self-care and to create space for rest and healing.
And it's also okay to acknowledge that some relationships might not survive the intensity of grief. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's not. It's about recognizing that grief can change the dynamics of relationships. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to create space for both ourselves and others to heal and to grow.
Now, one of the things I found most powerful in the book is this concept of remembering ourselves in grief.
Remembering, what does that mean?
It's this beautiful idea that grief can shatter our sense of self, leaving us feeling lost and fragmented.
Like the person we were before the loss no longer exists, and we're left trying to figure out who we are now.
Exactly. And so remembering is about reclaiming and rebuilding our sense of self in the aftermath. It's not about forgetting or erasing the past, but finding a way to carry it with us in a way that feels authentic and empowering.
So it's not about pretending that the loss never happened or trying to go back to who we were before.
Right. It's about acknowledging how grief has changed us and allowing those changes to shape who we are becoming. And it's a process that takes time and a lot of self-compassion. It's a journey, not a destination. And I think it's important to emphasize that there's no right or wrong way to do it. Everyone's journey is going to be unique.
Absolutely. And that's something Devine really emphasizes throughout the book. She encourages us to honor our own unique experiences and to resist the pressure to conform to societal expectations.
It's about trusting our own instincts and finding what feels authentic and true for us.
Exactly. She also talks about the importance of creating space for the full spectrum of emotions.
Because grief isn't just about sadness, is it?
No, not at all. There's anger, guilt, fear, even moments of joy. And she reminds us that all those emotions are valid, that they serve a purpose, and that suppressing them can actually make it harder to move through grief in a healthy way.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Eventually it's going to pop up and it might not be pretty.
Exactly. She also encourages us to be mindful of the language we use to talk about grief, both to ourselves and to others.
What do you mean?
Well, think about some of those common phrases we use, like getting over it or moving on. They can be really dismissive and make people feel like they're not allowed to grieve at their own pace.
It's like putting a timeline on grief, which is just ridiculous. There is no timeline.
Right. And so she suggests using language that is more compassionate and more accurate, like learning to live with loss or honoring our grief.
It's about creating a language that acknowledges the ongoing presence of loss, but also holds space for healing and growth. Now, something else a lot of people struggle with is this question of finding meaning and purpose in the midst of loss.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. It's something I've wrestled with myself.
And I think a lot of people feel pressure to find some grand meaning, some big lesson, which can be really overwhelming.
It can be. And Devine offers a perspective that is both honest and hopeful. She acknowledges that finding meaning isn't about erasing the pain or pretending everything happens for a reason.
So it's not about finding the meaning, it's about creating meaning moving forward.
Exactly. And she talks about the importance of finding new sources of joy and connection in our lives.
Right.
It doesn't mean we're forgetting about the person we lost or that their absence hurts any less.
It's about recognizing that grief is not the end of our story. It's a chapter in a larger narrative, a narrative that is still unfolding.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And it's about finding a way to embrace the present moment,
Yeah.
to cultivate gratitude for what we do have,
Yeah.
and to continue to move forward with hope and resilience.
And sometimes that means getting lost along the way.
It does, because
Yeah.
sometimes you have to get lost to find your way.
And I think it's also important to remember that while grief is a deeply personal experience, it's also a universal one. We all experience loss at some point in our lives.
Absolutely.
And while it can be incredibly isolating, it's also a reminder of our shared humanity, our capacity for love, and our ability to find strength and resilience in the face of adversity.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It really is. And that brings us to one of the most profound and hopeful messages in Devine's book. This idea that love is the only thing that lasts.
Oh, I love that quote. It speaks to the enduring nature of love, even in the face of death and loss.
It's something that a lot of people struggle with, the idea that our love for someone ends when they die. But Devine offers a different perspective.
What is that?
She suggests that our love for the people we've lost, it continues to live on in our hearts, in our memories, and in the ways we choose to honor their legacy.
So it's not about letting go of the love, it's about finding new ways to express it.
Exactly. She talks about finding those tangible ways to connect with the intangible, whether it's through writing, art, music, rituals, or simply living our lives in a way that honors their values and their memory. It's about recognizing that love transcends time and space.
It's those threads of connection that weave through the tapestry of grief.
Beautiful. She also talks about how it's okay to be open to new forms of love, new connections, new experiences that can bring us joy and meaning.
So it's not a betrayal of the love we've lost, it's an expansion of our capacity to love.
Exactly. Our hearts are big enough to hold both the grief of the past and the love of the present and the future.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important message you want our listeners to take away from all of this? If they only remember one thing, what would it be?
If I had to choose just one, it would be this. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be honored.
That's beautiful.
It's a journey, and it requires patience, compassion, and a willingness to surrender to the unknown.
It's about letting go of that need to control the experience and allowing ourselves to be guided by our intuition, our hearts.
And recognizing that there's no one right way to grieve. Everyone's journey is unique and valid.
So be kind to yourself, be patient with the process, and find those sources of support and connection that can help you navigate the darkness.
And remember, you're not alone in this. Grief is a universal experience. It's a reminder that we're all connected, and that even in our darkest moments, we have the capacity for profound love and resilience.
And for those of you listening who are looking for more guidance, more support on your journey, we highly recommend checking out Devine's book. She's got a ton of resources in there that can be so helpful.
It's a fantastic resource.
And remember, you are not alone. There are countless others who have walked this path before you, and they're ready to offer support and understanding. Reach out, find your tribe, and allow yourself to be supported. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into grief and loss. We hope this conversation has brought you some comfort, some insights, and maybe even a little bit of hope.